Okay, everybody. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and start. Um, the discussion this evening is entitled Revisiting Fundamentals, Right Understanding. And it's really about the relationship between right understanding, right intention, and right effort. They're kind of a package. And we'll talk about what right means historically in terms of Buddhist practice. I wanted to tell you that I'd been thinking about this talk for quite a while, and putting it together, I actually found very helpful for me personally. And so I'm hoping that there's some element in this that is helpful for you as well. So I'm going to start with, which I find I'm frequently doing now, with something about my grandson. So I have this little 8-year-old grandson, and he's become very involved in karate. So every one of his classes, I'm there at his classes, and I've been there long enough where, although I can't do any of that, they probably need to have 911 dialed if I were to try to do any of that. But even though I can't do it, I now have an eye for understanding all of the fundamental moves and how they're supposed to be done, and what they look like, and the amount of effort that you use to perform them. And so you can watch all these kids of various ages and various stages. And what becomes really clear is that some of the kids really understand it and get it, like that a movement has to be done in a certain way at a certain angle, and that other kids don't get it. And it's either that they don't understand it, so that they're not doing it properly, or they're shortcutting something to make it comfortable physically to do it. But in either case, once that foundational movement becomes a habit in a right way or a wrong way, stays with them. So, I've been there long enough where I can see kids that started with my grandson, and now they're moving up to more sophisticated things. And the kids like my grandson, they're just taking it on it easy because they have the fundamentals down properly. And the kids who don't, progressively it gets more difficult for them, because every succeeding thing is based on the fundamentals that they started with. Okay, does this make sense? All right. So whether it's dance, music, art, some kind of intellectual activity, this principle is quite important. And it will feather into the definition of, quote, right in just a minute. But I'd like to start with how this relates to the path itself, because I've always been struck by this sutta, this discourse that the historical Buddha gave, where he's reflecting on and describing the night of his awakening, and how he actually describes it, the imagery. And the imagery that he uses is as if he were in a dense forest or a dense jungle, and unexpectedly came upon an ancient city that had been lying dormant. And so, you're in this dense jungle, it's unclear, there's uncertainty, there's the unknown. And then in a moment, this is what insight is like, in a moment, there is this whole city. And so I find that of all the possible images that he could have used, that being not just fascinating, but significant, because it pinpoints that this particular practice is based on exploration and discovery. It's not a doing practice, it's not a creating practice, although we have to develop skill. But in the end, the reason Vipassana is called insight meditation is that the result of exploration and discovery, insight, is what liberates the mind. Okay? So it's about not just what is unknown, but it's what's possible that's unknown. And, as we move down the path, we begin to see that we have all of these limited, restricted beliefs and concepts and ideas about ourselves, about what we are, who we are, what we're possible of, and that these openings that can happen in a moment can radically change that understanding that we have. Utanjaniya has a quotation that I really like about insight, and he says, "Insight per se is not so important. What is important is whether or not the insight leads to transformation in your mind, which will enable you in the future to handle similar situations without craving, aversion, or delusion." So there's a lot of dramatic experiences that we can have in meditation. There's energy releases, there's imagery, there's sounds, internal sounds, and they can be breathtaking. But as Utanzani is saying here, and classically the definition of liberating insight is that we have an insight that actually adjusts, modifies, reframes, changes in some way the way that we understand our relationship with whatever that is. It could be a belief, an assumption, a deep habit that we have, a prior experience, our identity, and that begins to slowly open the mind. It begins to liberate the mind. So in this context, the definition of right, because it can really trigger people, right? When we're talking about right and wrong, really means something that is skillful, something that is helpful, something that is useful. The Buddha used the term well-trained in relationship to practice. So I think the way that you most commonly hear right understanding or right effort or right intention defined is in terms of result. Is that like, well, if I have the right understanding, right intention, or right effort, it will decrease the amount of struggle and suffering I have in relationship to a particular experience or my life, or will increase the level of satisfaction, peace, stability, equanimity that I have. So, it's a results-oriented definition. Well, I think that's helpful. I think what's more important is a definition that actually relates to the idea of exploration and discovery. And my understanding of right or skillful understanding is part of the exploration and discovery that's taking place for the purpose of understanding what leads to diminishing our suffering or increasing the level of peace and equanimity in our life. So that the idea of right or skillful or purposeful or well-trained is linked to purpose. That we're not just sitting down in meditation or engaging in some kind of activity in daily life just to be calm or to be equanimous, but we're actually doing it for the purpose of understanding in some deep way what points our mind in one direction or another direction. And the Buddha was so firm on this idea that he talked about there being two different kinds of people, and he used different terms for this, but the one that I'm going to use is, he talked about, quote, ordinary people. And ordinary people who are people who are basically trapped most of the time in craving, clinging, and identification. And so their life is primarily characterized by suffering. This may sound familiar. It sounds familiar to me. And the other kind of person, which I'm trying to be, is the Buddha talked about a person having a well-trained mind. And what he meant by that was that in the same way that in this little karate class that my grandson is involved, that we're actually training our minds in very fundamental ways to be looking for particular kinds of experience that help us understand suffering and peace. And the quotation that from the historical Buddha that has probably stuck with me more than any other is when he said, "I know of no other single thing so conducive to misery than an untrained mind. And I know of no other single thing so conducive to peace and happiness than a well-trained mind." So this all links up for me, this idea of right understanding or right skillfulness with exploration and discovery that is purposeful and is actually a training. I mean, we're actually working at it. So what historically does right understanding actually mean in terms of specific principles, not as a general concept? And there's a number of different ways that you can look at this, but one that is traditionally cited and is common, I think, is really helpful, and it shows how insistent the Buddha was on being attached in a healthy, positive way to the fundamental principles that he believed that were underpinning all aspects of his teachings, the psychology, the values, and methods. And so this is that practice, whether it's on a cushion or in daily life, should relate to what he said were the three characteristics of existence. And these will all sound familiar, but in terms of being skillful or right or correct or well-trained, it's not about philosophy or an idea. It's actually that these things that we've heard about before actually become part of our sitting practice, every sitting practice, and part of our daily life. So the first one is that the first characteristic is that everything is constantly and unceasingly changing, and whatever appears is dependent on whatever was present before it, that it's conditional. So it's about unceasing change, and the image that's frequently used is of a river or a stream. So if you're sitting on a bank and look at it, it kind of looks like there is a thing called a river, but if you step in it, it's completely alive, it's completely moving. It is constantly changing. There is nothing that you can identify or hold on to as a separate thing. So that river is a helpful organizing principle to name a process, but there isn't a thing there. There is this constant flow of experience with one thing morphing into another, and it's morphing into the other so quickly and so skillfully that at the normal level of awareness, we don't relate to it as a process. We relate to it as a thing. That's how we frame it. So the implications of this are really quite profound if we could get a hold of it as an actual experience, whether it's in sitting or in daily life, because it means that everything is constantly changing and it's dependent, which means that we have the ability to change the conditions and change the results. This is the hope that is embedded in Buddhist practice, that we can understand this in a very, very deep way, and that can lead to a whole different form of how we relate to our experience in our life. So that's the first characteristic. It sounds very simple. It sounds very straightforward, and I guess it is intellectually. And to actually have that experience when we sit down in meditation or in the middle of a discussion in daily life may be a different thing for many of us. The second characteristic is that because everything is constantly changing, incessantly changing, flowing from one thing into another, that there is nothing that is independent and separate. That every single living thing is like a stream. And it may be there may be different time windows of how that is happening, but everything is constantly in change. Now, because of the word that's used for this, which is anatta, no self, I've always thought that's kind of unfortunate because it immediately makes it about you and me, right? I mean, the mind immediately goes to, oh, well, there's no me, there's no myself. And, the Buddha was, the reason he chose the word anatta was that he was paralleling it with Atman, which is the individual self in the Upanishads and Brahmin religion and Hinduism that eventually merges with Brahman, which is the universal force. So he was very clearly saying that traditional view in Indian society he was rejecting. But I think we get lost on that because what he actually meant and what the teaching is that absolutely everything is empty of separateness. And our sense of self happens to be one of those things, but absolutely everything is empty of separateness. And so in the same way that the term river is a helpful metaphor or label or an organizing principle, that's what the sense of self is. It's incredibly valuable. It helps us negotiate the world, but the historical Buddha was saying that it's not a separate, independent thing. And the closest analogy that we can get to this is ego. And I'm sure everybody realizes we may forget this, but actually there is no such thing as an ego. I mean, like, everybody gets that, right? I mean, like 150 years ago, no one had even heard that there was such a thing as an ego. Didn't exist. It's a thought. It's an organizing principle. So in the same way that, we're constantly talking about ego and solidifying our understanding of things around an idea as if it is a real thing, this is what the historical Buddha was saying about the sense of self. That the sense of self is a very helpful organizing principle, but to attach to it as a separate thing is a guarantee of suffering. Okay? And the thing about the first two characteristics about constant change, morphing one into another, and that as a result of that, nothing is separate, both of these are boundary dissolving experiences. To the degree that we can drop into these in meditation or in daily life or in conversation with another person or in a sexual act, the management, the control, the direction of a seemingly separate sense of self dissolves. And we fall into a place of open awareness, of emptiness. And so this is this seminal experience that helps put the seeming solidity and sense of self into context. And what we're trying to do is shift more and more to have that experience rather than the locked down experience of self. So the third characteristic, one way you can think of this, is the answer to the question, well, what prevents us from actually experiencing life through the first two characteristics? I mean, if everything is in process, if it's flowing like a river, if there's nothing separate, and when we're in that place, there's a real sense of openness and liberation and freedom. What prevents us from being in that place more? And the answer to the question, there's a long answer and the real short answer that I'm going to give tonight, and which is in the same sutta where the Buddha is reflecting on his experience of the night of his awakening, is he said that he saw that the thing that breaks that flow of being and experience is craving, clinging, attachment, and identification. That's what creates the sense of separation. And then we identify that feeling of separation as a self. So those are the three characteristics of experience. I mean, we can get caught in a lot of shiny ideas and separate theories and different kinds of practices, but in the end, the Buddha was saying that the most fundamental understanding, the right understanding that our practice should be anchored in and that should be expressing itself in our practice should be these three things. So, let me see here. Okay, so I'm actually hitting most of the points that I wanted to so far. So I want to talk just briefly about right intention and right effort, and then try to put this into like a meditation format, so it's not just theory. So what would, quote, right intention or well-trained or skillful intention be in relationship to right understanding as we just defined it? And historically, really two things. The first is that right intention is the energy of the mind which focuses our attention and our effort on the three elements of right understanding. So like reflection before you sit, reflection after you sit, reflection before your day, actually setting an intention to be watching for, to be experiencing, to be exploring the three characteristics would be the first element of right intention. And the second element of right intention is actually focusing on three qualities of mind. And I find this interesting because there's a selectiveness, and when you hear it, you can see how it relates. So they're pairs. So the first one is that in whatever we do, in all of our practice, that there should be an element of renunciation or positively stated generosity, so that particularly with these three characteristics, they can really be triggering. They can be fearful. They can bring elements of fear up because we're so tightly identified with the sense of self. So restraint from going into certain states of mind, and then generosity towards them. The second one is non-harming, and the positive statement of it is loving kindness. So, enveloping the experiences that we're having in those to create a larger container. And the third non-harming positive statement of it is compassion. So two of the three are unconditional, unlimited states of mind. They're Brahma Viharas, compassion and loving kindness. And generosity is always the thing that when the Buddha would particularly talk to lay audiences, that's the first thing he would start with. He'd give a whole discussion about the role of generosity as creating the ground out of which exploration and discovery can take place, that it has to be open and generous. In other words, not limited. It's not an exploration, a kind of energy that has limits all around it. And then right effort is actually using our effort to implement right understanding and right intention. Okay, so that's kind of the package. So I want to talk just a moment about what might that look like in a meditation. And I'm just going to share with you the way that I try to use this myself and I find helpful. There may be something in it for you. So almost always when I sit down in meditation, before I kind of set everything up and set my body up, in that process that we went through, by the way, I think it's actually quite important to have some real body-based process for exploration, to create some balance and alignment and centeredness at the beginning of a meditation, because then that orients the mind during those qualities so that you make it tangible in your body and it becomes tangible in the mind. It's not like a quality you have to bring to it. You bring those qualities to the body and then they naturally inform the mind. So almost invariably, I will reflect for a couple of minutes on what I just talked about, that my intention for the sitting, among other things, but one of the deep intentions for every sitting is to actually see, experience, and explore these three fundamental characteristics of everything that's going to happen during that sitting. So to actually see and experience this flowing change, the arising, the temporary staying and the discontinuing and the morphing, that there actually isn't anything separate, and the thing that breaks it, the thing that causes me to struggle in the sitting, will always be some element of craving, clinging, or identification. So it's amazing. I mean, that little package is the whole ballgame. So, I mean, I really reflect on that in a deep way and set that intention to watch for that. And then the sitting itself is actually watching for those three things. And when craving appears, to actually recognize it and realize that although there's many things, the core element to bring to that, if we're talking about renunciation, non-harming, non-violence, generosity, loving kindness, and compassion, to craving is to restraint of just allowing whatever has arisen that appears to be negative, just to be there. It is what it is. Every experience is what it is, and it's not anything more than that unless we add something onto it. So something may be unpleasant, but that's all it is. And then because of the way we relate to something being unpleasant, we turn it into some real suffering. We struggle with it. We try to change it. We try to adapt it. We don't want it. If there's clinging or attachment that comes up, recognizing it, of course, is the whole ball game. But the core element is actually letting go, as opposed to letting it just be. It's now the mind has clamped down on something. So we have to do something. We have to work with it in a way that allows it to release. And then if that constriction has gone all the way to attachment, to identification, the sense of self, then we have to really try to recognize that it's, that's where we're really lost, right? It's the most difficult thing. And although we don't use this word very much in practice, we actually have to figure out some way in the moment to distance ourselves or disassociate ourselves from the identification. Now I am now identified with the state of mind, with the craving, with the attachment. So a lot of different techniques to do this, but it's recognizing that there is a thought, and that either I am not that thought. That's one stage, or it's just a thought. Or there's an emotion, I'm not that emotion, it's just an emotion, and whatever it is, whatever the blank is, each one of the sensory things and the mind, it's that separation that we're trying to create, so that we actually are separating from the thing that's causing us to separate from the flow of experience. And then the other element, and this is part of the reflection as well, is to really try to bring these three qualities of mind consistently to all the experiences that are taking place. So generosity, loving kindness, and compassion. It's not just using it as an antidote. Like something comes up, oh, now I'm going to be kind or generous or compassionate to that experience or that thing. It's like, no, you're actually holding your experiences, positive and negative, with those three qualities of mind. And the historical Buddha gave a series of talks where he actually talks about permeating the mind and the body with loving kindness and generosity and compassion. That's different than using it as a fix-it or an antidote. So for me, this is when I first discovered that, not just as an idea, but as a method, which then becomes a way that you're practicing, was a huge thing for me. It was some huge shift because I'd been using metta and compassion as an antidote. That's how it had been taught to me. And then I read these suttas and I realized that the Buddha had a much bigger vision for us of how these qualities of mind come into play. So the last thing I'd like to say, and then I'll have I'm a little later than I thought I was going to be. We'll at least have a minute or two to talk. Is this is all just a question of trial and error. This isn't about thought. And this is the reason that the second of the Eightfold Path is intention and then effort. I mean, like, we actually have to set an intention to cultivate the ability to practice in this way. And we have to devote our effort to doing it. It will not happen on its own. Okay, so I want to have just at least a minute or two for questions and answers, objections, arguments, whatever may be up.
That was really a great talk. I very much appreciated it.
Thank you, Karen.
I very much appreciated your metaphor of the river, because since nirvana is the ultimate extinguishing of all concepts, notions, and facing reality directly, it was so skillful, I think, what you said, that we look at a river, we have a concept of a river, we know what a river is, we know what some of its uses might be. But that's very different than just getting in the river and taking on the river directly, its currents, its temperature, its calmness, its violence, its rockiness, all of its qualities. And I think that metaphor also can be very directly related to what you said at the end, which was, as I took it, and correct me if I'm wrong, that a recapitulation process at the end of meditation is not so much to return back to the world of concepts, but that if we noticed, say, aversion, not so much getting back into the concept of aversion and, as you said, trying to find some panacea or antidote for it, or even identifying it as a function of self. Aversion is an energy. And so to contact that energy directly, I mean, Ajahn Sumedho his phrase is constantly, aversion is like this. And it's the energy of it. I think it's important to return to the embodied sense of, it feels like this. But it's not self. It's not our personal problem, and we don't have to fix it. In fact, our true nature is to be awakened, and aversion is an altered state of consciousness. Grasping is an altered state of consciousness. So there's nothing to achieve, really. It's just recognizing it and, as you said, letting it go. And I just thought that was very skillful. I appreciated it.
Thank you, Karen. I think it's interesting, this idea of like at the end of a sitting, just to reflect on what happened. It can be, I find, can be very valuable because one thing it does, just on a completely practical level, is just reflecting about the sitting. It's like, well, what's actually happening right now with my mind and my body. And sometimes I'll have sittings that are really calm and equanimous and quite clear, and others, I just see that my mind is really trapped in craving around a particular issue or attached to something. And being really clear about that then affects my judgment and my choices during the rest of the day. Because I'm watching for that, because there's an underlying tendency of the mind in that particular day that when I get up from that sitting, it just doesn't disappear. When I stand up from the sitting is revealing to me the quality and tendency of my mind on that particular morning before I do other things. So yeah, I find it really helpful in that way, because what's happening on the cushion is just a reflection of what's happening off of the cushion. So, I'll frequently change depending on the quality of that, particularly in my professional life. Sometimes you'll just see that your mind is kind of out of control. It's like, holy smokes, that's just unbelievable. And all intentionally, like I'll cancel telephone conferences or meetings, or I'll reschedule them to the afternoon, or I'll reschedule them to another day. Because if I'm representing a client, my obligation is to do my very best. And I can really see that quality of mind, I don't care how hard I try, I'm not going to do my best.
Well, that's right livelihood in action, I think.
Yeah, so I think it's very helpful that way. But then the other piece too is just to be awake to what's happening in your sittings. You begin to see habits. It's like, well, my mind actually isn't as bright and awake as I'd like it to. So, well, why is that? What are the because there's mechanics to sitting to help you be awake and have your mind bright. Mm-hmm. So if you see that your mind was not bright during a sitting, or that's happening over 3 or 4 or 5 days, then it's a wake-up call. Okay, so I need to look at that. And then sometimes we have insights that are clearly short-term or long-term significant. So mm-hmm. Actually acknowledge that.
Right.
So you can work with it later. So
yeah.
So thank you, Karen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so another comment or question or? Okay, so I would, let's see, I guess I'll just close by saying that, may the beauty of our effort to come together in this way, in a safe environment, and to look at these issues that, shape not only our lives, but every other life that we touch, is really quite a beautiful thing. And may the combined power of that intention and merit in some tangible way. Help those around us and all living beings to experience a greater depth of happiness and less suffering. And I particularly want to extend that to John Travis. So thanks very much for attending tonight and giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts with you. Okay.